The Cartoon History of the Universe, Volume 4, part of the Old Testament.
Yahoo! Wahoo!
By whatever name it has been called, and it's been called plenty, the stretch of ground between Egypt and the Euphrates River has had an unusually violent history. Way back in the Stone Age, the people of Jericho built the world's first walled city for protection against their neighbors. Later, the land was invaded by the Sumerians who wanted timber from the cedars of Lebanon. By the Egyptians for the copper and turquoise in the Sinai. By the Hyksos, see Volume 3, just because it happened to be in the way. By the Hittites who wanted control of the trade routes. By the Egyptians again to expel the Hittites. And by the Israelites, Philistines, Assyrians, Babylonians, Scythians, Persians, Macedonians, Romans, Arabs, Crusaders, Turks. But we're getting ahead of ourselves and you get the idea. Then, as now, the country's landscape was unusually varied. On the coast were independent cities, centers of trade and source of the precious purple dye that gave the land one of its names, Canaan, land of purple in Ugaritic. Next comes the coastal plain, plowed by farmers and cut by gulches, which carry the runoff from the mountains, where nomads and villages coexisted. Further inland, the hills get wilder until they drop off to the deep, steep valley of the Jordan River, the Dead Sea, and the oasis of Jericho, 1,300 feet below sea level. Beyond Jordan, the land rises again, finally leveling off in the Arabian Plateau. When they weren't being invaded, the people from different parts of Canaan would fight with each other.
Why are we fighting? I forget! God keeps in practice!
For now, we're concerned with part of the nomadic group known as the Hebrews. So get set. It's a pretty violent tale. Beyond a certain point, Hebrew origins are lost in the misty past. Then, Abraham, his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and their servants and flocks emerged from in Sumer, heading for greener pastures in Canaan.
Why Canaan? I hear it's the place to invade.
Watch it!
Once they arrived, it said, Abraham and Lot fathered many tribes. We'll skip the details and just mention that Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob, who changed his name to Israel, power with God, after wrestling with an angel in a late-night anxiety attack.
Give up!
Even the angels are violent here.
Jacob begat the 12 sons of Israel. One of whom, Joseph, ended up in Egypt with an Egyptian wife and an excellent government job.
Those are your brothers?
During hard times in Canaan, Joseph offered his kin some good land in the Egyptian district of Goshen, and there they settled happily, until, sometime after Joseph's death, they were enslaved. So says the book of Genesis. Losing his wife when Sodom went up in smoke, Lot and his daughters fled to the lonely hills above the Dead Sea. There, without any eligible husband, the girls got their father dead drunk and seduced him one by one.
Who's first? Let's draw lots.
They were trying to get children to support them in their old age.
How was it?
Likely better than waiting for Social Security to be invented.
The result was 2 boys named Moab and Ben-Ami, said to be the ancestors of the Moabites and the Ammonites, 2 tribes which must have had some confusing relationships.
This is my grandfather, also my father, my uncle, and his own father-in-law.
Is that why they call him Odd Lot?
Double Exodus. A few things the Bible doesn't mention also help to understand matters. Number 1, there were plenty of other slaves in Egypt too. Number 2, most of Canaan was under Egyptian rule, and some people there were stirring up trouble. Number 3, there were almost certainly some well-to-do Semites in Egypt, married to Egyptians and otherwise assimilated. It may have been from this class that Moses the Liberator came.
I can't understand it. What's he crying about?
We may well doubt the story of Moses' birth, but this much seems certain. Moses is an Egyptian name. Moses was raised in court as an Egyptian, and he must have had formal, cool Egyptian manners. Let's imagine him then as half Egyptian, a bit of a loner, and with a lot of repressed anger, which he couldn't always control. In the first reported episode of his adult life, Moses threw a tantrum and murdered an overseer for abusing the slaves.
You jackal! You witless! You fool! Take that! And that!
this one.
We've all heard how the baby Moses was cast adrift on the Nile, but before believing it, we should consider that the abandoned baby who becomes king theme also appears in the lives of Sargon of Akkad, Oedipus Rex, Cyrus of Persia, Romulus and Remus, and others. Many scholars believe the story was invented by official biographers to give the princes the right parents.
Thus, if Moses were actually an Egyptian, the bulrush's story serves to make him an honorary Hebrew.
But really, it's just so much bulrush, might one say?
Not if one wants tenure at Yale.
On the other hand, it's true that people often exposed unwanted babies in those days. So who knows?
Bye, son. Have a nice time in the palace.
You won't forget who gave you your first big break.
He skipped the country and took refuge with Jethro, a Midianite chief in the Sinai.
An Egyptian prince.
Actually, I'm half Hebrew.
Bless me, so am I.
Jethro must have filled the fugitive in on local history, politics, and religion, including his own roots.
It is said, he who wields this brazen serpent will free the people of Abraham.
Jethro also gave Moses his daughter, Zipporah.
Wow, a real Egyptian prince!
Oh, the shame of it. Me and this nomad she-camel.
While pondering the situation, Moses had a vision. A burning bush told him to go home and free the slaves.
Just say that I am sent you.
But, I can barely speak Hebrew.
Get an interpreter.
Like Jacob before him, Moses had a bad anxiety attack the night before arriving. In a frenzy, he made Zipporah circumcise their son.
Come on, it's an old Egyptian custom.
At this hour?
Came the dawn, he contacted Aaron and Miriam, the religious leaders of the Israelites.
Who sent you?
Oh, Yahuwah did.
While Aaron and Miriam spread his message to their people, Moses negotiated with Pharaoh.
You see these frogs? These are Yahoo's frogs.
As the talks dragged on, the slaves went on a looting spree. Finally, Pharaoh gave in, and a mixed multitude headed by Moses, the Israelite priests, and Joseph's mummy escaped in the night. They ditched some Egyptian troops in a marshy tideland, and Miriam led the women in song.
Sing ye unto Yahuwah, the horse and its rider have thrown into the sea.
They were free to wander a weird wilderness without food, water, or friends. One desert tribe, the Amalekites, was eternally cursed for their rage at this time. But Moses' stint in Midian hadn't been wasted. He knew about secret springs and odd edibles like manna, the secretion of a desert insect.
There, bug poop. I long for the flesh pots of Egypt.
I know flesh pot sounds sexy, but it just means a kettle of stew.
Kettle of stew sounds pretty sexy right now.
Tempers began running short, and Moses had his hands full judging disputes, when Jethro, his father-in-law, arrived and suggested,
Son-in-law, this is too much for one man. You need laws, judges, maybe even lawyers. You need time for your family. Zipporah is miserable.
Laws? What laws?
Oh, the usual stuff. Thou shalt not kill. That's big with us Midianites.
Of course, I already broke that one, but tell me more.
So, one wild and stormy day, Moses assembled the people before the mountain of God.
That ye may know the fear of Yahuwah.
Then he scaled the peak to get the laws directly from the Lord's mouth.
Yahoo! I am here!
He slipped his squib.
Moses was gone for the longest time, being something of a perfectionist.
Come on, boy. Let's try and hold it to 10. I can only carry so much stone.
Many biblical scholars see this assembly before the mount as the moment when all Israel beheld and feared the God of Moses. Yet they were already worshipping another god, a golden calf, by the time he got back. How impressed could they have been?
Thou shalt not kill. Perhaps I've been hasty.
Oh, wait us! Save us from Mountain Man!
Moses snatched the tablets, asked everyone loyal to Yahuwah to stand by him, and then ordered the slaughter of the calf worshippers. Now they were impressed. Moses' side of the story would be that he wanted unity at all costs.
Well, the vision could be fatal.
After the massacre, Moses climbed up for a fresh set of laws.
It's good for the legs, this law-giving.
The very first commandment was no gods before Yahoo. Golden calves were out. God's priests would be the men loyal to Moses against the calf people. The other commandments are the usual civilized rules against murder, theft, and impertinence. The book of Numbers is a litany of lawbreakers consumed by fire, swallowed by the earth, etc.
Israelites passed this way.
After the Exodus, Moses apparently kept the Egyptian obsession with cleanliness. Among his other laws are long lists of unclean meats, birds, and seafood, which the Orthodox will not touch to this day.
Thou shalt eat no owl.
Thanks, Lord. This may have put a crimp in the modern negotiations between Israel and Egypt.
I'll make you eat crow.
Never.
You'll eat your words.
The clean ones, possibly.
How about bologna and cheese?
An abomination.
Sure hope they get lunch settled soon.
So, on to the Promised Land, Canaan. Some spies were sent to check it out, and their report was most discouraging.
First of all, it's full of people. And they're 12 feet tall.
To me, they look 14 feet tall. They have iron chariots.
And huge walled cities.
The debate was short and one-sided.
With Yahoo's help, we can take them.
Stand here!
So Moses, fuming, took them back to an oasis in the wilderness, where they remained some 40 years, until most of the older generation, including Miriam and Aaron, had died. Meanwhile, the youngsters, led by Moses' protege Joshua, began raiding some neighboring tribes and building alliances with others. By Moses' dotage, they had become a fearsome army. With Canaan in view across the Jordan, the aged leader went up for a few last curses.
A perverse and crooked generation shall be burnt with hunger and devoured with burning heat. The sword without and terror within shall destroy the young man, and the virgin, the suckling, and men with gray hair. I will make mine arrows drunk with blood, and my sword will devour the flesh.
Without a doubt, this man's ideas and personality have left their mark on history. The Hebrews struck first at Jericho, an easy target. Hardly anyone lived there, and its walls were already crumbling, according to archaeologists. The Hebrew victory seemed miraculous to all sides.
The day the sun stands still. That's the day the Hebrews win anything.
Weird news, sire.
To make a long story, the book of Joshua short, the Hebrews conquered Canaan, putting the Canaanites to the sword and Canaanite culture to the torch. And so there was a second Exodus, in the reverse direction, as Canaanites and Egyptian loyalists fled to Egypt.
Prize Baal! Civilization again!
The Israelites buried Joseph's mummy, divided by tribes, and took over the abandoned land. A few moderns, seeing truth in both science and scripture, have sought to explain Old Testament miracles as everything from volcanoes and tidal waves to bizarre astronomical events.
The comet Venus swept by the Earth, reversed their rotation, rained down a few petroleum deposits, and then became a planet.
A tiny portion of the theories of Immanuel Velikovsky. There are probably a few of these nuts on every planet.
Behold, Jupiterians, more proof that our planet is round.
Don't even look, my clone. It's just another chariot of the gods.
Yes, Mother.
When was that again? You may have noticed by now that the time machine has been pretty vague about the exact date of these events. It would be nice if we could tie the Exodus in with known Egyptian history, but that's not so easy, I'm sorry to say. The best evidence so far, possibly, are the so-called Amarna letters, written by various princes to the pharaohs Amenhotep III and IV, and unearthed in the 1880s. I quote, "The king's whole land which has begun hostilities with me will be lost. Behold, the territory of Seir as far as Carmel. Its princes are wholly lost. Now the Habarai are occupying the king's cities. Let the king take care of his land, and send troops. If no troops come in the year, the whole territory of my lord the king will perish."
Here, take a letter.
If we're talking about the same thing, this puts the Hebrew conquest in the reign of Amenhotep IV. around 1380 through 1360 BC. The Exodus, by the Bible's account, was some 40 years earlier, say in 1420 or so. But if you saw Volume 3, you'll recall that Amenhotep IV was the same as Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who believed there was only one God. So, is this a coincidence, or did Akhenaten influence Moses, or vice versa? Or did they drink from the same well? Wasn't the Egyptian court of the time crawling with foreigners and their foreign ideas? Maybe Nefertiti herself? Then there's the question of how much of the Bible itself to believe, but I don't want to get into that right now, believe me. Onward! Judgment Days. Of course, the Israelites didn't really kill all the natives, so they ended up living among many surviving Canaanites, Jebusites, Horites, etc., etc. This caused a certain tension, especially since the Israelites, as former outcasts and slaves, rejected so many local institutions, like idolatry, art, personal wealth, horses, and chariots. In theory, at least. In practice, they were never 100% strict.
I'll just sneak a peek at this idol.
But they definitely frowned on kings. When Israel was led by anyone, it was someone who showed uncommon judgment in a crisis. So these leaders are called the judges.
With laws, who needs a king?
Like Deborah, a freelance singer and prophet who used to hold court under a palm tree.
Guilty!
With Israel under attack by the Canaanites, Deborah urged Barak, a fighting man, to call out the troops.
Arise, Barak! Arise!
I'll go if you will, Debbie.
No, I'll go if you will.
I asked first.
Since Barak didn't trust his own judgment, Deborah went along and led the army with him.
Truly the Lord will sell the Canaanites this day into the hand of a woman, you twerp.
The details are lost, but apparently it rained and the Canaanite chariots got stuck in the mud. As the Israelites swept over them, the enemy general Sisera fled on foot. As he passed a nomad's tent, a woman beckoned Sisera inside.
In here.
She gave him some milk and set him at ease.
My name's Jael. What's yours?
Sisera.
I thought so.
Then she drove a tent peg through his head. This episode is rendered poetically in the Song of Deborah, Judges 5, thought to be the oldest passage in the Bible, and one of a few in which the women are something besides victims or villains.
The mother of Sisera looked out at a window and cried, "Why is the chariot so long in coming?"
I wish we had more space for the judges, like Ehud, the left-handed who assassinated Eglon, a Moabite tyrant so fat that Ehud couldn't pull out his sword. Or Jephthah, who swore if God gave him victory, he'd sacrifice the first thing he saw when he got home. Turned out to be his daughter.
One doesn't lie to Yahoo.
There's no saying how long this wild and primitive state of affairs might have gone on, if it hadn't been for some problems over in Greece. Here come the Philistines. Briefly, the Greeks shared in the general collapse of Mediterranean civilization which took place in the 1200s BC. Invaded from the north and hurt by a drop in trade, Greek shippers turned to piracy and war, climaxing with the 10-year Trojan War, which involved and ruined most of Greece and its neighbors. Whole tribes took to the sea, among them the Philistines. More details next volume. During the reign of Ramses III, the Philistines attacked Egypt and were repulsed in a series of great sea battles. They rebounded to the coast of Canaan, every bit as desperate as Israel, but better equipped with chariots and iron. Immediately, they began to conquer the coastal plain, much to the alarm of the natives.
They have iron! Iron!
No wonder their clothes are always so neat.
The first time that Israel fought the Philistines, Israel was roundly trounced. So the Hebrew elders decided to bring out their secret weapon,
the Ark of the Covenant.
The Ark of the Covenant was Israel's most sacred object. A massive ornate wooden chest that had been with Joshua at Jericho, it held the laws of Moses and may have even carried Joseph's mummy. The troops cheered. Nevertheless, when the battle was over, the Philistines had the ark.
By daggone, that's heavy! Slow down! Slow down! Slow down!
This is why Philistine means someone to whom nothing is sacred.
Wait!
Anyway, when the Philistines got home to Ashdod, some of them were stricken with hemorrhoids.
Oh! You too? I told you that ark was too heavy!
They consulted their elders.
You have offended their God, and this is your punishment! And the cure?
Said the elders, make 5 golden hemorrhoids and 5 golden mice. There was a plague of mice, too, as an offering to the God of Israel.
How much longer, goldsmith? Archgold didn't quite prepare me for this.
These were sent back with the ark on a cart drawn by the finest cows. The overjoyed Hebrew priests slaughtered the animals, broke the cart into firewood, and made a burnt offering atop a large rock. The Bible doesn't say if this solved the Philistines' problems, but it didn't solve Israel's. Despite the return of the ark, Israel remained under Philistine rule for the next 20 years, until the emergence of Samuel, the last judge and maker of kings. The religious practice of animal sacrifice may have begun when priests first turned professional. To communicate with the gods, you brought a sheep to the priest, who cooked it and then read messages in the entrails.
Well, looks very, very good.
If everything checked out, the priest would eat the sacrifice.
I thought that was for God. It's okay, I'm his agent.
Samuel's story began when a childless woman, Hannah, went to temple and vowed inwardly,
Lord, if thou wilt give me a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord, and no razor shall touch his head.
Madam, are you drunk?
Eli, the priest, blessed Hannah. She went home and in time had a son, Samuel, whom she gave back to Eli to raise.
I vowed, and he's probably yours anyway.
Growing to manhood in the temple, Hannah's boy got a reputation as a prophet.
There's just something about him.
Doom!
It was the sons of Eli who had died guarding the ark against the Philistines, leaving only Samuel to judge Israel. When the time was right, 20 years later, he called out the troops. This time, the Israelites trounced the Philistines. It probably rained again. Samuel became Israel's leader, traveling from place to place to sit in judgment.
The First Circuit Court Judge!
It's a short circuit.
Then, as Samuel grew old, some of the elders approached him with a request.
Samuel, we want a king.
The Bible doesn't give all the reasons why they wanted a king, but we can guess.
Times have changed. We're a real nation now.
Other nations have kings.
We need someone to negotiate with them.
They think prophets are too weird.
Too inflexible.
Too heavy.
And we need a real army to fight those Philistines.
Well,
Samuel's reply is expressed more fully.
You know what you're asking for. A king will take your sheep, take your field, take your sons and daughters. He'll keep horses and chariots. He'll make you his slaves. I'll do it, but you'll be sorry.
To Samuel, a king was someone big enough to beat everyone else up. So he stopped looking when he saw Saul strolling down the Damascus road.
Call Saul!
After an interview, Samuel anointed Saul with holy oil and gave him a big kiss.
Congratulations, dear boy.
A few weeks later, Saul was proclaimed the first king of Israel.
Who's the rotund one?
Samuel, with his hair up.
The Hebrew custom of pouring oil on the king's head is thought to come from an Egyptian ceremony in which a royal governor swore loyalty to Pharaoh, the living god.
Pharaoh's oil on my head and trickling off my nose and all over my new loincloth, which I can easily replace on my governor's salary. Oh, glorious day.
In the case of the Hebrews, then, the anointing did not give the king absolute power, but rather meant that he was merely God's governor.
You won't forget who's boss now.
Don't rub it in.
For his first act as king, Saul cut some oxen into little pieces. He sent them throughout Israel with this message:
Whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and Samuel, the same shall be done to his oxen.
The turnout was excellent. He led the men against a band of Ammonites who were threatening to put out the eyes of some innocent villagers.
Damn, we never get to have any fun.
When the Ammonites ran without a fight, Saul was the man of the hour.
Ooh, Solly!
Blessed with victory, he sent his son Jonathan to attack a Philistine garrison. In retaliation, the rest of the Philistines turned out in force. And the Israelites turned around in force.
Hello, you men of the hour!
But your hour's up!
To the hills!
As if things weren't bad enough, Samuel really let him have it.
Oh, did I ever make a mistake when I picked you?
How fickle is fame!
Saul sank into melancholy and began to act strange. So that was the situation when the Philistines next came out for battle. In the best Greek tradition, their hugest hero, Goliath, paraded up and down between the lines with his shield bearer.
Come and get it, you dinks!
Israel's hugest was Saul, but he hung back. Instead, his singer volunteered.
What?
We all know how David faced Goliath without armor.
Har, har, har!
How, using his deadly skill with the sling,
Such as that's you're gonna get.
Huh?
he smacked Goliath a mighty smack between the eyes. How, as Goliath writhed in pain, David cut off the Philistine's head with his own sword.
Wonder if I qualify for severance pay.
Goliath was survived by 4 oversized sons: Ishbi-Benob, Zaph, Goliath Jr., and an unnamed giant with 6 fingers on each hand. They all grew up to become Philistine warriors, but what became of Goliath's shield-bearer we'll never know.
Now where'd he go?
After the battle, a new popular song got Saul's gall.
Saul has killed his 1,000, and David has killed his 10,000.
The moody monarch began to think about getting rid of the kids, so when the Princess Michal asked to marry David, Saul said yes.
Oh, thank you, Father.
On one impossible condition, he thought.
She's yours, if you bring me 100 foreskins of the Philistines.
No problem.
Naturally, David won the princess.
198, 199, 200. I'll take 2 of them.
A fairy tale come true.
One day, as Saul was playfully jabbing a javelin at David, he suddenly let fly. With the aid of Michal and Jonathan, David fled in the night.
I'd say your father has trouble with long-term relationship.
When Jonathan told his father that David was gone, Saul tried to run him through.
My son, the pervert!
But David was gone, to the hills, where he was joined by family, friends, and the poor and oppressed. These became known as David's mighty men, especially the ferocious Joab, David's right-hand mighty man.
I'm like Little John to your Robin Hood.
I haven't the faintest idea what you're babbling about, but I'm sure you're right, Joab, old boy.
Several times Saul tried to catch him, but David always gave him the slip. Saul said,
Isn't anybody sorry for me?
Then he got word the mighty men had gone over to the Philistines. He wanted Samuel's advice, but Samuel was dead. So Saul went to a witch, who called up his ghost.
I'll be seeing you soon enough. Now go away.
Within days, Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle with the Philistines. Witches, the bearers of ancient female lore, had a sort of fear-hate relationship with King Saul, and many men.
I hate that I can't control them, and I'm afraid they're talking about me.
Did witchcraft work? Well, in 1987, a scientist extracted a previously unknown antibiotic from the skin of frogs. Previously unknown to men, that is.
Frogs? Been prescribing them for years. But does Medicare reimburse?
Now David led the mighty men to Hebron, where the tribe of Judah crowned him king. The rest of Israel followed Ishbaal, a son of Saul. This split was a taste of things to come. For 2 years the rivals battled, and bit by bit the mighty men got the upper hand. Finally, Ishbaal was assassinated in bed. The killers brought his head to David. To their shock, he ordered them executed and their hands and feet cut off and hung up.
We don't go murdering kings in their beds.
And so, at age 30 or so, David became king of Israel. For his capital, David chose Jerusalem, a hill town occupied since 1800 BC by the Jebusites, a people whom Israel had never managed to conquer. Impressed by its strong position, David led an army against Jerusalem and took the city. Then he danced half naked through the streets, singing hymns of victory. David, superstar. After the parade, Michal gave David the business.
Isn't the king of Israel glorious, raising his skirts for every girl in town?
That was for Yahuwah, baby, and I'll lift my skirts for anyone I want to. Who's the king here anyway?
Well, she had reason to be upset. Her father and 2 brothers were dead, and David had taken a couple of other wives too. But after this spat, he never touched her again.
That temper reminds me of her father.
Sometime later, he was taking the air on the palace roof when he spotted the bathing Bathsheba.
Yaga!
Although she was married to Uriah the Hittite, one of the mighty men, David invited Bathsheba in for a visit.
Surprised?
Not exactly. I've been standing naked in front of that window for 3 weeks now.
Now Bathsheba got pregnant, so David did what any king would do under the circumstances.
I'll get rid of the husband and make an honest woman of her.
He called Uriah home from the wars.
My dear fellow, I've heard so much about you.
And gave him a letter to take back to General Joab.
No peeking now.
The letter, written I suppose in alphabetic script, said, in effect, take care of Uriah the Hittite.
Sometimes the boss really goes too far.
What'd it say, sir?
Never mind.
So Joab sent Uriah with a contingent of men too close to the walls of the city they were besieging. Naturally, the defenders were able to pick off several of them, including Uriah.
Tell the king there's good news and bad news.
After a proper period of mourning,
he's dead. He's dead.
David married Bathsheba, but their baby died. God's punishment, it was said. Still, they tried again, and the second effort worked. A son they named Solomon.
What a little wise guy.
The alphabet was invented at least twice in ancient Canaan, but all versions died out except for the one devised by Semitic copper miners in the Sinai. This 22-character script, based on Egyptian hieroglyphs, is the ancestor of all modern alphabets.
Huh, look at them slaves playing at writing.
They're just like little children, pretending to have the mental capacity for the finer things of civilization.
So it seems our system of writing is based on something made up for sending secret communiques.
I had the most interesting letter today. We rise with the sun. I just hope you boys see the historical significance of all this.
I get the message.
In Solomon's boyhood, the court of Israel grew rich, as David's armies put down the Philistines and forced tribute from all the neighboring kingdoms. Thus, unlike his father, Solomon grew up amidst wealth, power, diplomacy, and palace intrigue. He saw his half-sister Tamar raped by his half-brother Amnon. He saw another half-brother, Absalom, avenge the crime by murdering Amnon. A few years later, he saw the same Absalom lead a rebellion against David.
To your tents, O Israel!
He saw how David's mighty men put down the revolt, and how the fleeing Absalom got his head caught in a tree, and how General Joab personally helped cut him to bits. He saw King David mourn for his son, and Joab's anger.
Oh, Absalom, my son! You're making your friends look bad, goddammit!
He saw the revolt split the kingdom again, with the tribes of Judah and Benjamin following David, and the rest loyal to the house of Saul just as before. David spent his old age fighting to hold his kingdom together. Even the Philistines rose again.
I'm too old for this.
All this Solomon saw. As David lay dying, racked by chills, his advisors tried to warm him up with the beauty Abishag, and his sons began eyeing the throne.
I don't get it. This never failed before.
One, Adonijah, Lord Jah, staged his own coronation without inviting Solomon. Meanwhile, Bathsheba begged the dying king to favor her son.
As you value my life, Lord. He says yes.
Claiming David's blessing, the priests, prophets, and mighty men proclaimed Solomon king and held a huge parade. At the sight, Adonijah's friends turned tail.
I'll take that.
Adonijah ended up begging for mercy, and Solomon said,
If he shall show himself a worthy man, there shall not a hair of him fall to earth.
But as soon as David died, Solomon found an excuse to put his rival to death.
He asked for Abishag. Might as well have asked for the kingdom.
Adonijah's friends too were off, including old General Joab, as he clung to the tabernacle altar.
Give up?
Then Solomon spread a famous story. Two women, each claiming to be the mother of the same baby, put their case to Solomon. He suggested slicing the kid down the middle. One woman agreed.
Lengthwise or how?
But the other said she'd rather give it up than see it bisected. The second woman, said Solomon, was the real mother. Now, says the Bible, something odd happened. On hearing this incident, all Israel trembled. Why did they tremble?
Oh, there's just something about sliced babies.
I'll let you in on a little secret. This story is a political parable. Here's the key. False mother equals Solomon. Baby equals Israel. True mother equals Adonijah. Sword equals sword. The story unlocked. Solomon, the illegitimate heir to the throne, was willing to split the kingdom with civil war. Adonijah's family, the house of Saul, should give up the throne rather than see Israel divided. Now does the trembling make sense? So Solomon became Israel's most powerful king. And just as Samuel had foreseen, he laid heavy taxes, beefed up the chariotry, took hundreds of wives, and worshipped alien gods.
Oh, God, I can't look.
A few prophets denounced his rule, but nothing came of it, for the time being.
Arise! Arise, Jeroboam! Just suggesting an Egyptian holiday for the young man.
Then there were Solomon's building projects. He made a deal with Hiram, king of the sophisticated seaport of Tyre.
You hide him, and I fire him.
Did someone say sophisticated?
Solomon supplied gangs of laborers, 10,000 at a time, to cut Hiram's timber.
It's just like Egypt all over again.
Quiet, you!
Hiram supplied Tyrian ships, architects, engineers, metalworkers, ivory carvers, etc. We'll meet these Tyrian experts again and again, working for nations with less know-how than themselves.
Oh?
One measure of the scientific ability of ancient peoples is how accurately they computed the value of pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter, or 3.14159. The Egyptians had it at 256/81st, or 3.16049, and the Babylonians used 3 1/8, 3.125. The Babylonians in particular were a whiz with theoretical math.
Subtract 1/60th shekel weight, add 5 360ths, and we see you owe me exactly 37 360th sheep.
Can you break a ram?
The Bible, written during a slump in Egyptian and Babylonian civilization, mentions a giant round cauldron at Solomon's temple, 30 cubits around and 10 cubits across, giving the biblical value for pi at exactly 3.
Hey, that's why I had it built by outside consultant.
The wisest move, as always, sire.
The result was a large palace for Solomon and a somewhat smaller temple for Yahuwah. Solomon's harem was bigger. In these splendid digs, the king lived out his reign in peace, receiving foreign dignitaries and dropping the little bits of wisdom that made him famous.
The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit. The crown of the wise is their riches, but the foolishness of fools is their folly. The tongue of the wise useth knowledge aright, but the mouth of fools poureth out foolishness. Hey, I got 1 million of them.
Ever think of cutting it down to 10, Saul?
Split kingdom. During Solomon's reign, protest was muted, but after his death, plenty of disgruntled subjects came to the coronation of his son, Rehoboam. Their spokesman, Jeroboam, who had come out of hiding in Egypt, confronted the new king.
I'll get to the point. Are you gonna be an improvement on your father?
After checking with his advisors, Rehoboam gave this memorable answer.
My father chastised you with whips. I shall chastise you with scorpions.
To which Jeroboam made an equally memorable reply.
To your tents, O Israel!
At first, Rehoboam didn't take this seriously, but when they stoned his chief tax collector to death, he returned to Jerusalem in a hurry. Once again, the kingdom was split, this time for good. Rehoboam ruled the little realm of Judah from Jerusalem, and Jeroboam ruled the rest of Israel. Many friends of Solomon had to flee Israel for Judah, especially the priests. As a result, Judah became the center of the religion which naturally came to be known as Judaism. What happened in Israel we'll be seeing shortly. Meanwhile, Egypt, which was making a comeback, took advantage of the split to attack Judah, its nearest neighbor. Rehoboam wisely submitted, and Pharaoh carried off Solomon's fabulous wealth.
Where are my scorpions now that I need them?
Though poor, Judah did fairly well under Egyptian protection, and the house of David ruled without interruption. But in Israel, things went less smoothly. After Jeroboam's death, circa 915 BC, all his heirs were murdered by a rebel named Baasha. Baasha's heirs were cut off by Zimri, a captain of chariots, who reigned for 1 week. Zimri was toppled by Omri and burnt in the palace. Omri held on for life and left the throne to his son, Ahab. Assyria rising. Meanwhile, beyond the Euphrates River, from the hills north of Babylon, the kings of Ashur had begun the conquest which would build the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians inherited the religion, literature, and science of Sumer and Babylon, and they added some wacky ideas of their own. They were efficient administrators, maintaining a system of messengers and roads which paved the way for further conquests. The Assyrian priesthood, addicted to mumbo-jumbo, had let the practice of medicine slide from a reasonably high level into a mess of magic spells and incantations. One wonders what their medical schools were like.
Okay, from the top, class.
If the doctor sees a white pig, the patient will die. If the doctor sees a white pig, the patient will live.
This may explain why a sick Assyrian, instead of consulting a doctor, would usually just sit outside his doorway and take advice from anyone who cared to give it.
Amputate this nose, I'd say.
But it's my foot that hurt.
Why take chances? Open his nose!
Is this a second opinion?
A 15!
But where the Assyrians really excelled was at war, and woe to anyone who underestimated them.
The Assyrians,
another would-be imperial army.
Doomed to beat their heads against our walls like all the others. They perfected the use of armored battering rams, siege towers, and other devices for conquering walled cities.
Easy!
Then, after a victory, the Assyrians systematically burnt, flayed, tortured, beheaded, mutilated, impaled, and heaped up the heads of the vanquished. Then, they advertised the fact, in detail.
Ooh, shocking, terrible, wow!
It must have been hard being king of Assyria.
Oh dear, what shall it be today? Flay, flog, mutilate, impale, or put them on leashes in doghouses?
With Assyria rising in the east, the kings of Judah, Israel, Damascus, Tyre, Moab, etc., suddenly put aside their differences. This coalition was able to hold off the Assyrians temporarily in a battle on the Karkar River, 853 BC. But the indirect cost to Israel was tremendous. 25 years earlier, King Ahab cemented one alliance by marrying Jezebel, a princess of Tyre.
A dalliance for the alliance, dear.
Now Jezebel was most devoted to her gods, the Baal, lord of Tyre.
Honey, you're not a male chauvinist swine who'd make me worship his god without worshiping mine, are you?
Ahab, an accommodating sort, built a temple to the god in Samaria, his capital.
Looks just like Yahuwah's in Jerusalem.
Same architects. Oh.
Baal and Jezebel were denounced by the native prophets, especially Elijah the Tishbite, who prophesied dire times.
As the God of Israel liveth, there shall be no rain for 3 years.
When the rain stopped, Jezebel blamed the prophets of Yahuwah, and into the desert they went. As the drought lengthened, so did Elijah's reputation. It was said he was fed by crows.
Actually, he feeds us, but don't tell anyone.
And could resurrect the dead. Hello! Up against the Baal. After 3 years' drought, Ahab was out looking for water when Elijah suddenly appeared.
Aren't you the one responsible for this dry spell?
No, and I'll prove it!
He challenged the prophets of Baal to a duel.
I'll take on 450 of them, and bring your friends.
Before a large crowd, 2 altars were built, firewood added, and 2 slaughtered bulls laid on. Elijah said,
Call ye on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahuwah, and the God that answers by fire, let him be God.
All morning the prophets of Baal prayed for fire. They screamed, they howled, they slashed themselves with knives, but nothing worked.
And your wood is as dry as tinder. Tisk.
When Elijah's turn came, he did something odd.
Water! He's pouring water on it! Where did he get water?
3 times Elijah emptied his bucket, until everything was sopping.
What a dreadful, dreadful waste!
Then he called on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the whole works burst into flames. The people fell on their faces. Ever since, skeptics have wondered if it was really water Elijah poured, but at the time there were plenty of believers. Elijah ordered them to seize the priests of Baal.
Wait! Didn't you see him fumbling around up his sleeve? And where did he get water? Stop! Think!
Before Ahab's horrified gaze, Jezebel's friends were put to the sword.
By whichever God, what am I going to call the wife?
As the rains began, Elijah went for his life.
He did what?
Thinking he was as good as dead, he passed his mantle to Elisha, whom he found plowing a field.
Here, maybe the similarity of names will confuse him.
Elisha slaughtered his oxen, fed his neighbors, and ran off to join Elijah.
I take back anything I may have said about trouble-making prophets.
A fine boiled beef!
To see the sometimes strained relations between the ancient Israelites and their prophets, we might note an incident in the 2nd book of Kings. in which the prophet Elisha is mocked by a crowd of children.
Hey, are you bald or you just doing an imitation of Mount Sinai? He must be a prophet. His head looks like a crystal ball. Get a wig. Wah, wah.
So Elisha cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears from the wood, and tare 40 and 2 children of them. Second Book of Kings, verses 223 through 24.
When you write this story, make sure to leave out all the times the bears didn't show up.
Now 15 years passed. Elijah was dead. Ahab was dead. Ahab's son Joram ruled Israel, and his grandson Ahaziah ruled Judah. Jezebel still lived, and Elisha, now a royal consultant and leader of a large band of prophets, decided the time had come for a final solution to the Baal problem. He sent one of his prophets to seek out Jehu, an especially nasty captain of chariots.
This jab calls for a real ball-buster.
The messenger found Jehu with some friends, pulled him into a house, anointed him king, and ran off. Jehu and his supporters drove to Jezreel, where King Ahaziah was visiting King Joram. From the tower, the watchman reported,
"The driving is like the driving of Jehu, son of Nimshi, for he driveth furiously."
A couple of messengers left the city without coming back, so Joram and Ahaziah rode out to meet Jehu personally. This was the dialogue.
"Is it peace, Jehu?"
"What peace? So long as the whoredoms of thy mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so mad?"
As Joram turned to flee, Jehu, with his full strength, put an arrow through him.
"I don't think it's peace, Ahaziah."
After Ahaziah too was cut down, Jehu rode into town to find Jezebel. He appeared at a window and said,
Hazimra, peace, who slew his master?
Jehu just yelled,
"Who is on my side? Who?"
2 or 3 eunuchs stuck out their heads, and, at Jehu's order, threw the old queen down. Jehu's chariots trampled her body until nothing was left but the hands, feet, and head. Then he wrote to the elders in charge of Ahab's 70 children, challenging them either to fight or to send in the royal heads. The elders didn't take long to decide. The 70 heads were heaped in 2 piles at the city gate.
"And just no competition for the Assyrians."
What was the origin of eunuchs? One theory is that frenzied devotees of Ishtar would sacrifice their own organs to the sex goddess. Another idea is that kings, thinking of men as their oxen, would geld them as needed.
Look on the bright side. Now you're 100% aggression-free.
Whatever the case, kings found the plump and passionless eunuchs useful at court, especially as harem guards.
"What are you doing to the eunuch?"
Oh, honey, even a spayed cat likes to be scratched behind the ears.
After disposing of the rest of Ahab's servants, priests, and courtiers, as well as 42 brothers of Ahaziah, Jehu turned his attention to Baal, with this cryptic couplet.
"Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu shall serve him much."
He announced a great sacrifice to Baal, which none of the gods, priests, prophets, or worshippers dared to miss.
Oh, what a sacrifice this'll be.
When the temple was packed full, Jehu's soldiers barred the doors. A guard was posted around the building, and all inside were slaughtered.
Anyone gets out, and it's your life or theirs.
The statues of Baal were burned. The temple was knocked down and made into a public toilet. And the worship of Baal in Israel was ended. For a while, anyway.
An offering to Baal.
The only portrait we have of any Israelite king shows Jehu bowing to the Assyrian Shalmaneser III around 830 BC.
I admire your method.
The end. Israel eventually recovered from Jehu's coup, and by 750 BC was even having a golden age. New laws were written and the ancient tales retold, while the prophet Amos denounced luxury in the midst of poverty, a common feature of golden ages.
Woe to them that lie on beds of ivory, that drink wine in bowls and anoint themselves, but are not grieved by the afflictions of Joseph.
Very good show.
Then, about 740 BC, an Assyrian taxman was butchered by some citizens of Tyre.
And fail!
The Assyrian army swept down, committed the usual atrocities, and tramped through northern Israel as a show of strength. By collecting an emergency tax of 50 shekels a head, King Menahem was able to buy them off for a time. But the sudden poverty sparked a revolt, and within 5 years the Assyrians came back to put it down. Each time they came, the Assyrians marched tens of thousands of Israelites out of the country, resettling them in northern Assyria, some 900 miles away. Finally, in 722 BC, Samaria, the capital, fell. 27,290 citizens were removed, and, just like that, the kingdom of Israel was finished. The deported population has become known as the 10 Lost Tribes of Israel.
Where are we, anyway?
Lost!
Hey, it's like Exodus all over again.
That's not funny.
The Assyrians replaced them with a similar number of people from other parts of the empire.
Okay, Babylonians go over here, Hittites go there, We got a hole somewhere. Get me a Babylonian mathematician.
The new arrivals combined their own religion with some Israelite ideas and became the Samaritans, the first Jewish sect. The people of Judah were aghast.
Oh my God! They're sacrificing children! Barbarians! We haven't done that in 600 years!
The only good Samaritan is a dead Samaritan.
Witnessing Israel's disasters from neighboring Judah, the prophet Isaiah wrote, "The heart of his people was moved, as the trees of the forest are moved with the wind." And the king of Judah gave many gifts to the king of Assyria.
Yum yum! Kissy kissy! Licky licky!
I like this!
However, at the first sign of Assyrian weakness, the Judean leaders began plotting with the Egyptians. So, in 701 BC, the Assyrians trashed a good part of Judah, took 200,000 prisoners, and besieged Jerusalem. Isaiah said,
"As birds fly, so will the Lord of hosts protect Jerusalem."
The Assyrians were stricken by plague, lifted the siege, and Jerusalem was miraculously saved, an event which left a deep impression.
I told you so! I told you so!
By carefully choosing its allies, the all but ruined kingdom of Judah managed to survive another 100 years, actually outliving the Assyrian Empire, which fell to the Babylonians in 612 BC. And so it was the Babylonians and not the Assyrians who finally conquered Judah. In 597 BC, the empire builder Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem, marched some 20,000 of the upper classes back to Babylon, and set up a puppet prince, Zedekiah, to rule over those who remained.
I hope this doesn't get to be a habit.
But Zedekiah plotted a revolt. So in 586, Nebu came back and executed Zedekiah's sons before his eyes.
Why? What could be more cruel than this?
You'll see, or rather, you won't.
Then he put out Zedekiah's eyes. The last violent act of this volume, I promise.
Where'd you get this idea, sire?
Ever see the Three Stooges go to Babylon?
Many of the rebels escaped to Egypt, while Nebuchadnezzar took a few thousand more captives back to Babylon. It was another 70 years before the famous handwriting on the wall foretold the freedom of these captives. Strange, isn't it, that they should still have worshipped a god who promised them Canaan, but gave them Babylon instead?
What do you make of this graffiti? Meeny, meeny, tekel, upharsin.
Farsin, something to do with the Persians, I guess.
The waters of Babylon.
Next, the Shah of Iran, and the Greeks.